The corridor outside the nursery was silent when the night shift royal guard noticed a smear on the polished railing, too small to be from an accident, too recent to have been logged. He stopped, gloved fingers hovering over the radio. The security camera above the door was still recording, but its indicator light flickered once, then steadied. Something in the palace routine had shifted, and he felt it immediately. The surveillance indicator above console 3 was not flashing, only trembling faintly, a weak pulse of amber light that appeared and disappeared as if struggling to be noticed. Most guards on the night rotation would have ignored it. The palace systems produced small irregularities often enough that experience taught restraint. But Guard Armand had developed a habit of respecting minor anomalies. The monitoring room was cool, the air carrying the low mechanical scent of circuitry and polished metal, and the steady hum of ventilation filled the silence like distant wind. Rows of screens cast pale light across the floor, illuminating the edges of desks and the crease lines of Armand's gloves as he leaned forward and keyed in the channel history tied to the indicator. A continuity gap appeared in the log, only a few seconds, automatically restored, not significant enough to trigger an alert to command. Still, the system had preserved the recording buffer. Armand began playback. The image resolved into a private sitting room adjoining the apartments of Princess Charlotte, the youngest child of the royal household, a room seldom occupied by anyone outside the immediate family and tutors. Lamps glowed softly, reflecting off a lacquered table scattered with writing materials. At first the scene was still, empty, unremarkable. Then the door opened, and the princess entered, guided by the queen consort. Armand straightened slightly in his chair, not out of curiosity but from discipline. Recordings involving senior royals required careful observation. The camera carried no sound, but body language often spoke clearly enough. The princess stood near the table, shoulders drawn inward, hands clasped too tightly to be comfortable. The queen consort spoke, her gestures controlled but sharp, and the child lowered her gaze, nodding once, then again, as if struggling to answer correctly. Armand watched without moving, his eyes tracking the small details, the child's rigid posture, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the tension visible even through the grain of the recording. Then, without warning, the queen consort struck her. The motion was precise and swift, not theatrical or uncontrolled, but firm enough that the princess staggered sideways, catching the edge of the table to keep from falling. Armand felt it tightening in his chest, but kept his expression neutral, forcing himself to observe rather than react. The queen consort seized the child's wrist and pulled her closer, speaking again, her face set in an expression that carried more severity than instruction. The princess's mouth moved as if trying to respond, but her shoulders trembled, and she lowered her head again, shrinking inward. After several seconds, the queen consort released her and turned away, exiting the room. The princess remained where she was, motionless, then slowly sat down, her small hands folded in her lap, her head bowed, as though she were trying to disappear into stillness. The recording ended abruptly as the camera returned to standard corridor rotation. Armand exhaled slowly, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. He replayed the footage, this time focusing on the details surrounding the event rather than the action itself, the timestamp, the absence of attendants, the duration between entry and exit. Palace discipline was strict, no guard pretended otherwise. Royal children were trained under relentless expectations, corrected frequently, prepared for lives in which error carried consequences far beyond ordinary experience. Yet what he had seen did not resemble formal correction. It resembled something personal, something uncontrolled. He paused the frame on the final image of the princess seated alone and leaned back slightly, listening to the quiet rum of the room, aware of the faint vibration of the building beneath his boots. Protocol provided clear guidance in most circumstances. Any irregular recording involving members of the royal household was to be logged and forwarded to Internal Security Command without commentary or interpretation. Guards observed, they did not judge. Yet another principle existed, less often cited but no less binding, the obligation to protect minors under the Crown's care. Armand rested his gloved hands on the console, staring at the frozen image, aware that the decision before him was not about what he had seen, but about what he would do with it. Armand began reviewing the adjacent feeds from the same corridor, scrolling backward and forward through the timeline with deliberate patience. The palace at that hour had been quiet. A maid passed carrying lemons, pausing briefly near a service cabinet before continuing on, never approaching the sitting room. A footman crossed the far end of the hall several minutes later, his pace unhurried, his attention fixed on a tray he carried toward the west stairwell. No physician, no nurse, no attendant entered the princess's quarters in the hour following the incident. Armand opened the infirmary access log linked to the wing and read each line by line. There were records for a kitchen burn treated just after dusk, a stable hand with a strained shoulder, and a routine examination scheduled for a visiting child of a foreign delegation earlier that afternoon. Nothing referenced the princess. The absence unsettled him more than the footage itself. Injuries to royal children, even minor ones, were ordinarily documented with meticulous care, sometimes to the point of redundancy. Silence in the record suggested either neglect or intention, and neither possibility fit comfortably within the ordered world Armand believed he served. He closed the log and sat still for a moment, listening. The monitoring room carried the steady, mechanical quiet of a sealed space. The surveillance indicator above Console 3 was not flashing, only trembling faintly, a weak pulse of amber light that appeared and disappeared as if struggling to be noticed. Most guards on the night rotation would have ignored it. The palace systems produced small irregularities often enough that experience taught restraint. But Guard Armand had developed a habit of respecting minor anomalies. The monitoring room was cool, the air carrying the low mechanical scent of circuitry and polished metal, and the steady hum of ventilation filled the silence like distant wind. Rows of screens cast pale light across the floor, illuminating the edges of desks and the crease lines of Armand's gloves as he leaned forward and keyed in the channel history tied to the indicator. A continuity gap appeared in the log, only a few seconds, automatically restored, not significant enough to trigger an alert to command. Still, the system had preserved the recording buffer. Armand began playback. The image resolved into a private sitting room adjoining the apartments of Princess Charlotte, the youngest child of the royal household, a room seldom occupied by anyone outside the immediate family and tutors. Lamps glowed softly, reflecting off a lacquered table scattered with writing materials. At first the scene was still, empty, unremarkable. Then the door opened, and the princess entered, guided by the queen consort. Armand straightened slightly in his chair, not out of curiosity but from discipline. Recordings involving senior royals required careful observation. The camera carried no sound, but body language often spoke clearly enough. The princess stood near the table, shoulders drawn inward, hands clasped too tightly to be comfortable. The queen consort spoke, her gestures controlled but sharp, and the child lowered her gaze, nodding once, then again, as if struggling to answer correctly. Armand watched without moving, his eyes tracking the small details, the child's rigid posture, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the tension visible even through the grain of the recording. Then, without warning, the queen consort struck her. The motion was precise and swift, not theatrical or uncontrolled, but firm enough that the princess staggered sideways, catching the edge of the table to keep from falling. Armand felt it tightening in his chest, but kept his expression neutral, forcing himself to observe rather than react. The queen consort seized the child's wrist and pulled her closer, speaking again, her face set in an expression that carried more severity than instruction. The princess's mouth moved as if trying to respond, but her shoulders trembled, and she lowered her head again, shrinking inward. After several seconds, the queen consort released her and turned away, exiting the room. The princess remained where she was, motionless, then slowly sat down, her small hands folded in her lap, her head bowed, as though she were trying to disappear into stillness. The recording ended abruptly as the camera returned to standard corridor rotation. Armand exhaled slowly, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. He replayed the footage, this time focusing on the details surrounding the event rather than the action itself, the timestamp, the absence of attendants, the duration between entry and exit. Palace discipline was strict, no guard pretended otherwise. Royal children were trained under relentless expectations, corrected frequently, prepared for lives in which error carried consequences far beyond ordinary experience. Yet what he had seen did not resemble formal correction. It resembled something personal, something uncontrolled. He paused the frame on the final image of the princess seated alone and leaned back slightly, listening to the quiet rum of the room, aware of the faint vibration of the building beneath his boots. Protocol provided clear guidance in most circumstances. Any irregular recording involving members of the royal household was to be logged and forwarded to Internal Security Command without commentary or interpretation. At first light, the palace changed character. The stillness of night giving way to the quiet, efficient movement of staff preparing the household for the day. Armand reported off the night watch as usual, his manner composed, his signature precise in the duty ledger, betraying nothing of what he had seen. The eastern corridors were washed in pale winter sunlight filtering through tall windows, the marble floors cool beneath his boots as he walked toward the administrative wing. Verification, he reminded himself, was part of duty. Records existed so that uncertainty could be replaced with fact. The infirmary office was already open, two clerks arranging ledgers on a long table beneath a row of brass lamps. Armand requested access to the previous evening's medical log, presenting his credentials without explanation. The clerks complied without question. Guards routinely confirmed entries when incidents occurred in residential wings. He read slowly, line by line, allowing his eyes to rest on each notation long enough to be certain nothing had been overlooked. Minor injuries, routine consultations, a visiting official complaining of fatigue. Each entry was complete, signed, and time-stamped. There was no mention of Princess Charlotte. He checked the supplemental register used for private consultations within royal apartments, a separate log maintained with greater discretion. It, too, was blank for the relevant hours. Closing the ledger, Armand felt the faint pressure of unease settle more firmly in his chest. Absence of record might have been understandable if the incident had been trivial, but what he had witnessed had not been trivial. Palace physicians were meticulous, sometimes excessively so, precisely because the health of royal children carried political as well as personal consequence. A failure to record even a minor examination would have been unusual. A complete absence of notation suggested that no physician had been summoned at all. Leaving the infirmary, Armand crossed into the long corridor overlooking the inner gardens. Frost still clung to the edges of the hedges below, and gardeners moved slowly among the paths, their breath faint in the cold air. The calm order of the scene contrasted sharply with the memory of the recording, and for a moment he stood at the railing, letting the cold stone beneath his gloved hands steady his thoughts. Protocol was clear. A guard did not approach a senior royal directly, nor did he intervene in domestic discipline unless immediate physical danger was present. What he had witnessed existed in a narrow space between those definitions, disturbing, but not, by strict interpretation, an active threat. Yet the image of the princess afterward, alone and motionless, resisted such technical boundaries. Armand turned and continued down the corridor toward the security archives, where access to surveillance backups was more tightly controlled. Inside, the air was cooler, the walls lined with locked cabinets and terminals used for long-term storage. He requested the relevant recording under the pretext of verifying a signal fault, a routine justification that required no further explanation. Once alone at a terminal, he reviewed the footage again, this time noting precise timestamps, camera angles, and the sequence of corridor activity before and after the incident. He began writing these details in a small personal notebook he carried for shift observations, not an official log, merely a tool many guards used to track irregularities until they could be formally recorded. As the pen moved across the page, he was aware that he was stepping into uncertain ground. Recording evidence privately without authorization was not explicitly forbidden, but it was understood to be unnecessary if proper channels were followed. And yet proper channels depended on evidence remaining intact long enough to be reviewed. Armand closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket, aware that what he was doing was no longer simple verification. It was preparation, though for what he could not yet say. Later that morning, while assigned to corridor patrol near the nursery wing, Armand kept his pace steady and his expression neutral, careful not to draw attention to his presence. The wing was quieter than usual. Normally, attendants moved in a gentle but constant rhythm, nurses carrying trays, tutors arriving with books, footmen exchanging linens. Today, the movement seemed reduced, the hallways holding a subdued stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of curtains shifting in the draft. As he passed the outer sitting room adjoining the princess's apartments, the door opened briefly, and a maid stepped out carrying a small basket of folded cloths. Her eyes flicked toward Armand for a fraction of a second before lowering again, her posture stiff, as if conscious of being observed even in a routine task. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, but said nothing, continuing on without slowing. At the far end of the corridor, he paused near a tall window, using the reflection in the glass to observe the hallway behind him. Two attendants entered the princess's apartments, both unfamiliar to him, their uniforms marked with the insignia of a reduced domestic detail, often assigned during periods of private family time. The change was subtle but significant. A smaller staff presence meant fewer witnesses, fewer routine entries in the daily logs. Armand felt a quiet certainty forming that the incident he had seen was not unknown to the household, but managed, contained within a controlled circle of awareness. The realization carried its own weight. If others already knew, then reporting through ordinary channels might not bring scrutiny, but silence. As he resumed his patrol, a senior aide approached from the opposite direction, a man named Rahim, whose responsibilities often placed him near the private apartments. Rahim greeted him courteously, his tone mild, yet there was a deliberate quality in his words. "The nursery wing is quieter than usual," the aide remarked, glancing toward the closed doors. "The household prefers discretion when the children require rest. It is best that unnecessary attention be avoided." The statement was phrased as a general observation, but the implication was clear enough. Armand inclined his head in acknowledgement, offering the neutral response expected of him. Understood. Rahim held his gaze for a moment longer, then continued on, his footsteps fading into the distant echo of the corridor. Armand remained still, listening to the silence that followed, aware that the boundaries around the matter were being drawn not through orders, but through suggestion, through carefully chosen words that discouraged inquiry without ever forbidding it outright.
He continued his patrol, passing the closed doors of the princess's apartments once more. From within came no sound, no voices, no movement, only the faint hush of ventilation. The absence of noise felt heavier than any disturbance might have been. As he reached the stairwell and descended toward the lower corridors, Armand understood with growing clarity that the decision before him was no longer theoretical. Silence was not neutral, it was an action, one that allowed whatever had begun to continue unchallenged. Yet speaking would mean stepping beyond the safety of routine, beyond the protection of unquestioned obedience. The pressure was subtle but constant, like the steady weight of the palace itself, pressing down through stone and steel, reminding him that every choice within its walls carried consequences that rarely ended where they began.
The next days settled into a pattern that appeared ordinary to anyone not looking closely, yet to Armand the differences were unmistakable. His patrol assignments rotated as usual, but he found himself repeatedly positioned near the nursery wing, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes by quiet request when shift changes were arranged. The corridors there carried a subdued atmosphere, as though sound itself had been lowered. Servants spoke more softly, footsteps were measured, and doors were closed more often than open. Princess Charlotte was rarely seen, and when she was, it was only in brief, carefully managed moments, crossing from one room to another, accompanied by a single attendant rather than the usual small cluster of staff. One morning, Armand observed her from the far end of the gallery as she walked beside a nurse toward the reading room. The child's posture was composed, her expression calm in the way royal children were trained to be in public, yet her movements were slower than before, her gaze lowered, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She did not look up even when passing beneath the tall windows where sunlight fell across the marble floor in pale rectangles. Armand kept his attention forward, not allowing his observation to linger long enough to draw notice, but the image remained with him. Later that afternoon, he reviewed corridor logs under the pretext of verifying patrol timings. The records showed subtle irregularities, small gaps in routine entries, staff rotations altered without the usual annotations, a camera in the secondary passage temporarily disabled for maintenance without a corresponding work order from engineering. None of these details alone would have justified concern. Together they formed a pattern that suggested deliberate simplification of the record rather than random oversight. Armand noted the times carefully in his notebook, writing in small, precise script that could be mistaken for routine scheduling notes if seen by another guard. He felt no sense of defiance in doing so, only a growing awareness that facts not preserved tended to vanish. That evening, while stationed near the service stairwell adjoining the nursery wing, he overheard two junior attendants speaking in hushed voices. They fell silent as soon as they noticed him, lowering their eyes and moving past quickly, their conversation unfinished. The reaction was subtle but telling. Ordinary domestic matters rarely produced such caution. The palace functioned on layers of discretion, yet there was a difference between privacy and tension, and Armand had begun to recognize the latter in small gestures. The way a servant hesitated before answering a simple question, the way doors closed a fraction too quickly when footsteps approached. None of it constituted evidence, yet together it formed an atmosphere difficult to ignore. As the evening deepened and lamps were lit along the corridors, Armand took position near the inner vestibule, a place from which he could observe both the nursery wing entrance and the adjacent gallery. The air carried a faint chill from the stone walls, and the distant echo of footsteps traveled clearly through the quiet. Shortly after dusk, a senior court physician entered the wing, accompanied not by a nurse, but by a single administrative aide.
The visit was brief, less than 10 minutes, and when they emerged, the physician's expression was composed but distant, his eyes fixed ahead, as if unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. No entry appeared in the infirmary log that night. Armin confirmed it himself before leaving his shift, the blank space in the ledger more eloquent than any written report. The absence of record no longer felt accidental, it felt intentional, as if the machinery of the palace had quietly agreed not to see. 2 days later, the pressure became less subtle. Armin had just completed a routine patrol of the West Corridor when he was summoned to a small administrative office adjacent to the guard quarters, a room used for briefings and documentation reviews. Inside, Captain Farouk sat behind a narrow desk, a folder open before him. The captain's manner was calm, almost cordial, yet there was a deliberate weight in his stillness that signaled the conversation would not be casual. "You've been thorough in your patrol reports," Farouk said, topping the folder lightly. "Diligence is commendable, but there is such a thing as unnecessary attention." Armin stood at attention, saying nothing. The captain continued, his voice even. "Certain areas of the palace require a lighter presence at times, the nursery wing, for example. Family matters can be sensitive, and excessive observation can create misunderstandings." The words were carefully chosen, not an order, not even a reprimand, but unmistakably a warning. Armin acknowledged with a brief nod. "Understood, sir." Farouk studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether further explanation was needed, then closed the folder. "Good. Continue your duties as assigned." The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes, yet as Armin stepped back into the corridor, the air felt heavier, the quiet more pronounced. The message was clear. Awareness was acceptable. Scrutiny was not. That evening, during patrol, he passed the nursery wing again and noticed that 2 of the usual guards had been reassigned, replaced by personnel from another rotation who were less familiar with the routines of the household. The change was subtle, easily explained as scheduling necessity, yet the timing suggested otherwise. Fewer familiar eyes meant fewer people likely to notice deviations from normal patterns. As he walked the length of the corridor, the lamps casting warm pools of light along the walls, Armin felt the weight of the decision before him growing steadily more defined. The incident he had witnessed was no longer an isolated event preserved in a recording. It had become part of a larger structure of silence, supported by omissions in records, careful language from aides, and quiet adjustments in staffing. Each layer made formal reporting less certain to produce results and more certain to provoke resistance. Near the end of his shift, he paused at a window overlooking the inner courtyard. Night had settled fully, the sky dark above the stone balustrades, a single lantern burning near the garden path. The palace appeared tranquil, almost serene, yet Armin knew how easily appearances could conceal reality. He thought of the princess walking slowly beside her nurse, of the physician's brief, unrecorded visit, of the captain's measured warning. None of these things constituted proof of wrongdoing beyond the moment captured on camera, yet together they formed a pattern of containment too deliberate to ignore. Standing there in the quiet, Armin understood that the choice before him was no longer whether to act, but how, and how soon, because with each passing day, the pressure to remain silent was becoming not only external, but internal, the steady erosion of certainty that comes when a man is surrounded by voices, polite and reasonable, all suggesting that what he has seen is not his concern.
Armin did not make the decision in a single moment. It formed gradually, shaped by the accumulation of small confirmations that silence was no longer neutral. The final certainty came late one evening as he reviewed patrol rotations in the quiet records room. A maintenance notice had been filed for the camera outside the secondary passage to the nursery wing, scheduled for deactivation the following night for routine recalibration. The request carried proper authorization codes, yet the engineering department had issued no corresponding work order. It was a minor discrepancy, the kind that might pass unnoticed in the steady flow of administrative paperwork, but to Armin it signaled intention. Cameras were not disabled near royal children without careful planning. He closed the file and sat still for several minutes, listening to the faint rustle of papers shifting in the ventilation draft, aware that the pattern he had been observing was tightening rather than fading. Evidence was not being ignored, it was being managed. The palace contained procedures for nearly every contingency, some so rarely invoked that many guards completed their service without ever seeing them used. One of these was the Minor Royal Safeguard Protocol, a mechanism designed decades earlier after a succession dispute had endangered a young heir. The protocol allowed any sworn guard to initiate a confidential welfare review if credible concern existed regarding the physical or psychological safety of a minor royal. Activation bypassed standard internal reporting channels and notified a small, independent panel attached to the Crown's legal office. The threshold for invoking it was intentionally high, not in evidence but in consequence. Any guard who initiated the process without sufficient cause could face suspension, dismissal, or formal charges for insubordination. Armin had studied the procedure during training years earlier, committing it to memory as an abstract principle rather than a realistic possibility. Now it no longer felt abstract. He returned to the surveillance archive and reviewed the recording once more, forcing himself to watch with the detachment of an investigator rather than the reaction of a witness. The actions were clear, the child's distress unmistakable, the absence of medical documentation verifiable. Beyond that lay the subtler indications, the altered logs, the warnings, and the quiet reduction in staff presence. None of these alone would justify escalation, but together they formed a consistent narrative of containment. He opened his notebook and organized his observations into a precise timeline, writing carefully, ensuring each entry could be corroborated by existing records or footage. The act of writing brought a certain calm, a sense of order imposed on uncertainty. Yet beneath that calm he felt the steady awareness that once the protocol was invoked, events would move beyond his control. His career, his reputation, possibly even his freedom could be affected. The palace valued loyalty, and loyalty was often interpreted as discretion. Armin closed the notebook and placed it beside the terminal, staring at the inactive screen for a long moment. He thought of the princess sitting alone in the lamplight, of the way her shoulders had drawn inward as if bracing against something inevitable. That image, more than any regulation or warning, settled the matter. He rose, retrieved the sealed forms required for protocol initiation from a locked cabinet, and carried them to a small desk near the rear of the room where the light was steady and the corridor beyond remained empty. The pen felt heavier than usual in his hand as he began to write. Completing the documentation required patience and precision. Each statement had to be factual, free of interpretation, supported by timestamps and verifiable observations. Armin described the footage without embellishment, noted the absence of medical entries, and listed the irregularities in staffing and surveillance with exact dates and times. He attached authorization requests to preserve the original recording and prevent its alteration or deletion, a safeguard automatically triggered once the protocol was filed. When he finished, he reviewed every line again, ensuring that nothing in his wording suggested personal judgment. The strength of the report would lie in its restraint, not its emotion. The final step required submission through a secure terminal linked directly to the legal office. Access was restricted, and each use was logged permanently. Armin entered his credentials, aware that from this moment forward his actions would be visible to authorities far beyond his immediate chain of command. The screen prompted for confirmation, a single line of text asking whether he understood the consequences of initiating a minor royal safeguard review. He read the sentence twice, then pressed the confirmation key. For a second, nothing happened. Then the terminal emitted a soft tone, and a notice appeared indicating that the request had been received and encrypted, with response expected within 12 hours. The process was irreversible. Armin sat back, listening to the quiet hum of the room, feeling neither relief nor fear, only a steady stillness, as if a weight long carried had shifted but not disappeared. He secured the documents in a sealed envelope as required and placed them in the designated lockbox for collection by the legal courier at dawn. When he stepped into the corridor, the palace was silent, the night deep and undisturbed. Lamps cast long, warm reflections along the marble floor, and somewhere far above, a clock struck the hour, its sound echoing faintly through the stone. Armin resumed his patrol as if nothing had changed, yet he knew that by morning the stillness would begin to fracture, quietly at first, then unmistakably. The inquiry team would arrive without ceremony, the records would be examined, and questions would be asked in rooms where rank offered less protection than usual. He also knew that once the process began, there would be consequences, not only for those under investigation, but for the guard who had initiated it. As he passed the nursery wing, he paused briefly, looking at the closed doors behind which the princess slept. The corridor was empty, the air cool and still, the silence unbroken. For the first time since watching the recording, Armin felt certain of one thing. Whatever followed, the silence surrounding that child would not remain unchallenged.
The inquiry team arrived just after dawn, without escort and without ceremony, entering through the administrative gate rather than the main court as visiting officials normally would. Armin observed their arrival from a distance while standing his assigned post near the inner corridor. There were only 3 of them, a legal examiner in a dark overcoat, a medical specialist carrying a narrow leather case, and a clerk who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to recording difficult truths. Their presence drew little attention. In a palace accustomed to constant movement, 3 unfamiliar figures could pass almost unnoticed, yet the effect on those who recognized their authority was immediate and subdued. Within an hour, sealed requests for records began to circulate. Surveillance archives were secured, infirmary logs were withdrawn for review, and access to the nursery wing was temporarily restricted under the pretext of a routine health assessment. No announcement was made, no visible disruption allowed to disturb the outward rhythm of the household. Servants continued their duties, courtiers passed through galleries in quiet conversation, and the queen consort's public schedule for the day remained unchanged. The machinery of appearance moved forward as if nothing had shifted, yet beneath the surface the atmosphere had altered, the corridors carrying a tension that was perceptible only in small details, the way conversations stopped when footsteps approached, the way aides moved more quickly than usual, the way guards exchanged brief glances without speaking. Armin was summoned once, briefly, to confirm the chain of custody for the surveillance recording. The legal examiner asked precise, restrained questions concerned only with verifiable facts, the time of discovery, the method of retrieval, the preservation of the file. There was no commentary, no expression of judgment, only the steady accumulation of information. When the questioning ended, the examiner inclined his head in acknowledgment and dismissed him without remark. The neutrality of the exchange left Armin uncertain whether his actions were viewed as necessary diligence or unwelcome disruption. Later, that afternoon, the medical specialist entered the princess's apartments accompanied by a senior nurse and remained inside for nearly an hour.
No one spoke of what occurred during that time, but when the door finally opened, Princess Charlotte emerged with the nurse at her side, her expression calm yet subdued, her small hand resting lightly on the nurse's sleeve as if seeking quiet reassurance. She was escorted not back to her usual rooms, but to a suite in the adjacent wing, one typically reserved for convalescents and supervised care. The relocation was carried out with discretion, the corridors cleared in advance to avoid attention, yet word traveled in the subtle ways it always did, carried in whispers and glances, in the sudden appearance of additional guards near previously quiet doors. Armand watched from a distance as the procession passed, careful to maintain the formal stillness expected of him, yet he felt a quiet certainty that the decision he had made days earlier had now crossed a threshold beyond reversal. The process was no longer his, it belonged to the mechanisms of law and duty that governed the crown itself. And yet, as the doors of the supervised suite closed behind the princess, he understood that the outcome, whatever consequences might follow him personally, had already achieved its most essential purpose. The days that followed unfolded with the same restrained efficiency. The queen consort continued to appear at official engagements, her composure unaltered, her duties performed with the same measured dignity as always. To the public eye, nothing had changed. Within the palace, however, quiet restrictions took shape. Access to the nursery wing was reorganized, domestic staff assignments adjusted, and the queen consort's private meetings with the children were now routinely accompanied by attendants whose presence could be justified as instructional or medical support. No formal announcement explained these changes, yet their meaning was understood by those who observed carefully. The inquiry itself proceeded behind closed doors, its findings sealed under the authority of the Crown's legal office. Armand was not called again to testify, nor was he informed of the conclusions. His role had been limited to the initiation of the process. What followed lay beyond his rank and clearance. A week later, orders arrived reassigning him to a distant provincial residence, effective immediately. The notice was written in neutral language, citing routine rotation of experienced personnel to outlying posts, yet the timing left little doubt about the underlying cause. When he reported to Captain Farouk for departure instructions, the captain's manner was formal but not unkind. "Your service record remains commendable," Farouk said quietly, signing the transfer papers. "Remember that discipline and judgment are both forms of loyalty. They do not always lead to the same place." It was not praise, nor was it condemnation, only a statement of fact delivered with the calm gravity of a man who understood the cost of decisions made in silence. On his final evening in the palace, Armand walked once more through the inner courtyard, the air cool and still, the lamps casting steady pools of light across the stone. From a distant window he could see the supervised suite where the princess now resided, a single lamp glowing behind drawn curtains. There was no sound, no movement visible, only the quiet assurance that she was no longer alone, that her welfare was now subject to watchful oversight rather than private discretion. Armand stood there for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the winter wind, aware of the vast structure of the palace rising around him, its walls holding countless stories that would never be spoken aloud. His own part in one of those stories would soon be forgotten, reduced to a sealed report in an archive few would ever read. Yet as he turned and walked toward the gate where a carriage waited to carry him to his new post, he felt no regret, only a steady acceptance of the price he had paid. Within the ordered silence of the palace, a child who could not protect herself had been heard, and for Armand, that knowledge was enough.